Yeah, good afternoon. This is wildlife biologist Eric Orr from New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife. Well, today I'm going to talk about moose in New Hampshire and tagging moose in particular. And this is actually moose drop their antlers every year, and a friend of mine gave this to me some years ago. And but I'm going to talk about our New Hampshire moose and how we happen to end up with over 3,000 today. Actually, if you go back in history, moose were pretty much eliminated from the state by the early 1900s, and finally in 1901 the moose season was stopped when there were probably fewer than maybe a dozen moose in the state. That number slowly grew. In the 1950s and 60s. There was estimated to be maybe 50 moose in the state, and habitat changes. The spruce budworm came in, and a lot of trees were cut up north and salvaged, and a number of things, plus protection, brought about an increase in moose numbers. Well, my supervisor, Henry Laramie, had worked for the Fishing Game Department since the, I think, late 40s, and by the early 1980s he had a camp up in Pittsburg, New Hampshire, and was paying attention to the growing number of moose. In fact, I remember when I was first with the Fishing Game Department in the early 1980s, that when the conservation officers, or in some states they call it game wardens, would come down to headquarters for training, Henry would invite them up to his office, and he would pull out a whole series of topographic maps. He would ask the conservation officers, now, have you seen any moose, and where were they? Did you see any cows with calves? So by the early 80s he was tracking a change in our moose population, and by 1985 he was convinced we needed to have a moose biologist, and so found funding for to hire our first moose biologist, Chris Rhines, who to this day is still New Hampshire's first and only moose biologist. So by 1986 we decided to do a study of the moose. Funding was available, and it was elected to put out some radio collars on about 20 moose that year. So Chris Rhines ordered up the collars, and by the end of July they had arrived. Well, we went up in late July, and we did capture and tag 8 or 10 moose. So about half the collars are out. So we went back up in September to finish the job of putting out the 20 radio collars on the moose in order to track them for the next 2 or 3 years. And according to my diary, a fateful night was September 24th. Said it was sunny and warm, with some thunder in the distance. So that night, I should tell you that I really had a leg up. We had Chris Rhines, the moose biologist, Scott Williamson, our deer biologist, Ed Robinson was with us that night, and myself. So basically we cruised Route 3 in Pittsburgh in our fishing game pickups, and we used our tranquilizer guns to shoot from the vehicle at moose that were roadside. Now, moose are attracted to the road salt that is heavily used in the North Country. It would melt and accumulate off the road in the mud bog next to the road, so there would be moose in there slurping up the mud, and you could hear them. So we would ride along at nighttime, and when we would approach one of these areas where the moose were congregating, we would turn on the light, and if there was a moose there, fire a dart at it. Well, our darts, because moose are big, they required a lot of tranquilizing drug, so the darts were made of aluminum. They were about that long, almost 8 inches long, plus we had a radio transmitter attached to the back of it. So it kind of flew like a rock. You had to actually lob it at a moose. But because I had experience tagging bears for 6 or 7 years already and tranquilizing them, plus I'd worked on Long Island in Winnipesaukee removing some deer a few years before, I had a lot of experience in capturing wildlife with a tranquilizer gun, and I'd already done a couple of moose that had wandered into urban situations. So this particular night, as we were cruising Route 3, big bull moose crossed the road right in front of Ed and I. Now, we'd at this point tagged almost all cows. I think all cows to that point. But Chris had decided we could do a couple of bulls. So this big bull slowly strode across the road. As he got to the far side, I fired a dart into him. Well, the tranquilizer we use, and is still used today, it takes 10 or 15 minutes for the animal to go down under the best situation. So when you fire a dart at an animal, you immediately turn the lights off, you turn the vehicle off, and you sit there quietly for 10 or 15 minutes. Then I would get out in the darkness and get out my my radio antenna and the receiver, and I would listen for the ping of the dart that's lodged in the rump of the moose. So this night I went out into the cutoff where the moose was. He was probably 100 or more yards from the road, and the other folks had arrived and they were sitting roadside. And also this night we had Dixie Sherrod. She was the chief of the information and education section of Fish and Game at the time, and she had was disappointed and complained a bit that nobody had taken pictures. Well, when you're handling a moose, it's all hands on board. You really don't have time to take pictures. So Dixie was with us that night to take pictures. Well, as I went out to see if I could find this moose and crept along through the brush and the cutoff, and it was a mess, a tangled mess to get out there. Well, finally, I could tell from the ping of the dart that I was getting close, so I got ever closer, and I kneeled down. Now my job was to go out there and find the moose in the darkness, and I would put earplugs in it and a blindfold over it, because a light or a noise would cause the animal, the moose, to get up and run off, so we didn't want that. So as I got to the moose, I could hear a big noise nearby, and I put the earplugs in the moose and blindfolded him, and I turned my headlight on, and there's another huge moose looking down at us. So I'm guessing these moose were thinking about kind of sparring that night, or certainly this other one wanted to do some damage to that moose who was on the ground, and I was hoping I wouldn't get in his way. So I turned my headlight on, and Chris and Ed and Scott came out to the moose, and it takes 10 or 15 or 20 minutes to work it up. We had to put the radio collar on it and make sure it was the right fit, and put ear tags in the moose. And then when that's all done, Chris would actually have an anti-tranquilizer, kind of like, you hear about Narcan. Well, this was Narcan for moose, and she would inject that drug into the jugular vein of the moose, and within a minute they would stand up and usually walk off. By then we would kind of scatter to be away from the moose. So this night Chris injected the moose in the jugular vein, and sure enough he got up, and everybody kind of scattered. And it had been my habit for most of the moose we captured to kind of stand by to make sure they got away and were able to walk and walk away fine. So I kind of moved off maybe 30 or 40 feet in the darkness and waited as the moose ambled off. Well, he went down, and I could tell when he went down that his head was in a puddle of water, because I could hear him blowing bubbles. I said, oh no, this moose is going to drown. So I ran over to the moose and picked his head up with his antlers, and he jumped back to his feet. Well, so I bolted some distance. In fact, I ran into a big brush pile maybe 40 or 50 feet away. I could go no further. And I turned around with my headlight still on, and there's the moose. It was an unhappy moose. He was looking at me. He was not very happy with the treatment he just had. His ears were back, and the hair on his neck and back was standing up straight. I knew I had an angry moose on my hands. And sure enough, he dropped his head and came at me like a freight train through the brush. And as he approached me, I reached up and turned my light off. Well, I had learned from being trampled by a couple of cows that I stood by that the light kind of attracts them like a moth, or maybe I think this guy he was out to do me in. But when I turned the light off, he stopped within arm's reach, right there. And he stood there for a few seconds, and then he turned his head. When he did, I had to actually dodge his antlers as it swept by me. And he put his head down, and he headed off to Ed and Scott and Chris, who were walking out, or maybe 60 yards or so then. And I yelled out, "He's coming at you, watch it!" And this moose was very angry. He was headed right for him. I could just see headlights dodging in every direction, and went right through the three of them and somehow missed them. And there's Dixie leaning on the far side of the pickup on Route 3 with her headlight on and her camera ready for action. Well, she got it, but didn't get the picture. That moose ran to the side of Route 3 and ran right into the side of that pickup. When I got out there, there was a big dent in the side of that pickup where that moose was taking out his frustration. And I walked around the other side of the pickup, and there stood Dixie with her eyes the size of saucers. And all she could say was, "Geez, did you see the size of his ovaries?" Right then and there, I knew she wasn't a wildlife biologist. As that moose walked away, it wasn't his ovaries hanging there. But we all had a great laugh, and we had a wonderful time. We ended up collaring all 20 moose, and moose have thrived ever since, and we've had a hunting season since 1988. I have lots more stories about that too, but that's the night that the big bull moose, the big angry bull moose, charged me, and I stopped it in its tracks.